All right, today we're going to be working with some different sky painting designs. So I've taped off my paper into 3 separate areas so that I can practice 3 different skies. Although I'm realizing now I'll probably want to tape off the top and the bottom because when I'm done and if I want to cut these out, it'd be nice to have the same type of white border everywhere. So I'm actually going to tape off the top and the bottom too. When you are using watercolor tape, or it's not really actually watercolor tape, it's just painter's tape. This is actually drafting tape. You want the kind of tape that will remove without tearing the paper. However, there is no perfect tape, so even the best tape can still tear the paper. At the end, I'll talk about how to try to remove it the best you can, even if it's stuck a little bit. It's not the end of the world. Now, all 3 skies that I am doing today are all using the technique called wet on wet. That means I am getting the paper wet before I even add any color. When you are doing wet on wet, you don't want big puddles, so I got the paper wet, but I didn't just pile on the water. I spread it around and tried to even it out before adding my color. So sometimes I'll use the edge of the water cup to dry off my brush or my handy dandy towel there tucked under my paint palette just to get some of that excess water off. Because now that I'm adding my paint also has water in it, hence wet on wet, and so there's even more water being added. So I don't want it to be too soaking. If there are big pools, then all the color likes to go to the same spot and not lay flat or even on your paper. This first sky, I'm doing just a classic sunset, which is warm colors, red, orange, yellow. I don't actually have a yellow paint, so I'm going to use my red and yellow and just have them meet halfway in the middle and create orange. This actually works really well because then the orange, will be a true middle point because the orange will be created with your yellow and red. So it's nice to have just yellow and red and mix them together to make that orange. It really helps them all feel connected so you don't end up with an orange or a red or a yellow that doesn't match the other ones, because even though these are all warm colors, there can be different types of those colors. There could be a cooler red or a warmer orange compared to others. So that's just a quick tip there. Now I'm really just adding a few extra layers of color because I know that watercolor dries lighter than it is when it's wet. So I'm trying to add some extra layers of color so it dries brighter than it would if I just did a very light layer. So it's okay to kind of pile on some of the pigment and make it extra bright. Next, I'm going to paint more of a night sky and using still multiple colors, but more of the blues and purples, in this case kind of blues and reds. So I'm getting my whole paper wet once again, trying to keep it into that one area. That tape is a nice barrier, but if I go a little crazy, I could splash onto my other skies. So I'm trying to keep it calm and even. Once the whole paper is wet, then I'll start with my first color, and my first color will be the blue. I have this nice dark blue that I wish I knew the name of because I don't think it's one of my Winsor Newton Cotman colors, which is what I usually use. It was on this paint palette when a friend gifted it to me because it was something that they had used before. So I really need to figure out what color this is because I use it a lot. I love the richness of the blue. So I'm spreading out this blue in the top part of my paper, and then I'm going to let it kind of fade into a color at the bottom. So what I'm doing now is I'm lifting out some of the water. As I was adding the blue, I realized that there was a little too much water, so I'm drying my brush and then going back over to try to soak up some of the water with my own brush. That way I can add more pigment and let it actually sit on top as opposed to just swirling around and moving places I don't want it. So it's nice to dry it just a tiny bit before adding more of that blue. I'll speed through that little process there. All I did was bring the blue down to the bottom because now when I add my red on top, it'll slowly start mixing with the blue. This is the same technique I used with the yellow and the red in the previous sky, and now that way the red and the blue will mix and make a lovely purple in the middle. I'm keeping my brush strokes horizontal for all of my sky paintings today because if you think about the sky, you look across the sky. If your paint strokes were going up and down, it can make the sky look off. It feels more like a waterfall and movement is going up and down when you really want the movement going side to side. Now, I know the actual sky doesn't really have a direction, but for some reason, it just seems to make sense when our brush strokes or the movement is side to side when it comes to a sky. So just in case your brush strokes show up, you want to keep them horizontal. Now on this last painting, I'm going to be giving some clouds a try. I've been playing a lot with clouds lately and really enjoying the challenge. It is a challenge because one thing with watercolor is you can't paint white. So what I'm going to be doing is trying to paint around the white of my paper to let some of that highlight and that brightness show up in my clouds. I'm going to do kind of a daytime sky with a little bit of pink sunset-y colors with it. So I'm using a lighter blue this time, different than my nighttime sky. And I'm going to be using horizontal strokes. However, I'm going to kind of jump around the paper. So look how I'm leaving a lot of white space in between these blue paint strokes. You want to start with the most white possible and then slowly take away the white. That way you can always well, not always, but you don't have to worry about going back to adding more white since you are just slowly covering up the white. I'm trying to make my clouds feel more random and not exact, so I'm really being kind of loose with my brush, jumping it, wiggling it, dashing it around, and just leaving small spaces. If I was really thinking, I would have tried to leave the clouds bigger at the top and smaller at the bottom, because if you look out at a cloudy sky, the clouds closest to you are highest up in your vision, and the clouds furthest away are lower in your vision. So the lower clouds should be smaller and look like they're further away. I've got an idea of how to edit my clouds a little bit when I'm going back later. Now I'm starting to add little bits of pink at the bottoms of the white shapes. I want to keep the top of my clouds as white as possible because that's where the highlight is going to be. So I'm giving some shadow to my clouds by adding this pinky purple. It's going to start mixing with the blue because I made this whole area wet. Also keep in mind, it must not be very, very wet or my colors wouldn't stay where they are right now. So make sure that before you really drop in color, you have looked for any puddles or big areas that are going to be full of water. You want it to be wet, but just not puddly. Now I'm going back with a clean brush and I am spiraling that red into the white of my cloud. I want my brush clean because I'm just trying to blend the pink into the white, but not cover up the white with the pink. And I'm also going to go in and add little bits of pink into some of the blue areas just to add more interest and show more parts of clouds that are blending into the sky. Clouds is a lot of playfulness and just kind of experimenting with which brushes work best, which colors work best, where do they go. A lot of it is trial and error, but looking at some photos of clouds can be a little helpful to get ideas of where are the shadows, where are the highlights. However, you don't want to expect that your art will look exactly like a real cloud photo because watercolor is a lot more suggestive and impressionistic, not exact. Because my paper is still wet, I can actually go back and lift some of the color off of the paper. So I have a tissue here that I've been using for a few paintings, so it's got a lot of paint on it. I'm finding a clean spot and I'm dabbing down on the paper to lift some of the wet paint out. This won't make it exactly bright white, but it will, again, create those highlights and blurriness to my clouds. So this is something that has to happen while my paper is wet. I can lift up out that paint and create more and more white spaces. I'm really going to do this in my top clouds to try to make them feel a little bigger than when I first created them, hopefully then making them feel closer to me. Last, I'm going to go back in again with some of my pink and create a little more definition. So I'm trying to change where the different layers of the cloud might be. I'm still keeping the tops of my clouds white, but I'm adding some wiggly lines to kind of separate the different puffs in my clouds. After my night sky started to dry, I realized it wasn't as dark as I wanted it to be. So once a full area is dry, you can always go back and add another layer to it. I then used my hairdryer to speed up the drying process. Now it's time to think about what designs I want to add to my skies. You could of course stop here, they're beautiful skies, lots of pretty colors, but adding a silhouette with pen is a great way to add some interest to your picture. There are literally an infinite array of possibilities of what you could draw in front of your sky. Here I'm choosing a lighthouse for my sunset, kind of up on a cliff edge. I literally made a list in my notebook the other day thinking about what things I could draw in front of sunsets. Lighthouse was on it. Mountains is a classic. Birds are always fun. You could even do like a lamppost or a fence or hills or grass or close-up flowers, a building, ski chair lift. I've been wanting to do that one for a while. So anything where you can recognize it by seeing the outline and only in black is something you can do as a silhouette, because a silhouette is what you would see when there is a back source light to the thing you're looking at. The light is behind the object, therefore you can't see the details on it and you only see an outline of it and it's in shadow. That's why it's all black. What I'm going to do now is just fill in this silhouette so you can really see the full black shape of it. I'm not going to worry about details or texture. I'm using a like drawing pen. I'll put the brand in the description below, but mostly I use my Micron felt tip pens, especially because those, if I were to paint something on top of them, they won't bleed. But I also have some other pens that are great for filling in big areas because my Micron pens are good for little details. Now in my clouds, I really had to think about my silhouette because there's no ground. It feels like I'm looking really high up because it's all clouds. So I decided something in the sky would make the most sense for a silhouette, which in this case could be a hot air balloon. So I drew the outline of my balloon and I'll fill that in just like the rest of my silhouettes. Something I'm doing with my air balloon silhouette is I'm making different sized air balloons, so some feel closer and some feel further away. The easiest way to do that in the sky is by size. So by making a very small one, if it looks like that one is far away, maybe there's a whole group hanging out. Now I have to decide what to do in my night sky. It took a little bit of thinking, and then I remembered that I also have some white pens that are pretty fun to use too. So I decided to embrace the night sky part of it. I've already mentioned that mountains are a classic, so of course I'll have to add those to this one. To do mountains, I like to use a jagged edge that's not all the same, so some high points, some low, some small, some big. Makes it look more natural. Now I've gotten out my white pen. It is a Sakura Gelly Roll, and it is great at painting on top of watercolor. It won't be perfectly bright white, but it does really show up well. I'm pretty satisfied with how these ones work. So I'm using it to create a small moon in the center of my sky, and then I'll just use a lot of little dots to create a starry effect around it. These stars are going to look a lot brighter on the darker areas of my sky, so I want to be careful about how many I place there. If I have too many, it can just look too busy, and I also don't want them to be perfectly evenly spaced. I want it to feel random, just like the stars in the sky. Some are closer together, some are further apart. So I do those random dots all in my sky, and then I'll go back and fill in my mountains. Okay, it's finally time to remove our tape. So I'm going to take off the piece of tape that is closest to me, so it's on the top of all the other tapes, and I'm going to pull away at a 90-degree angle. So I'm pulling the tape away from the paper, not pulling up from the table, but pulling off to the side away from the paper. So 90-degree, like flat on the table, if that makes any sense. So pulling away, not up. Now, I mentioned before that it is not a perfect method, especially these tape pieces in the middle. I know I'm going to tear the paper. So I'm just going to take it slow. I'm going to try to peel from both sides a little bit. And if I see the paper start to tear, yep, I can feel it tearing. I really want to just press my hand down and keep that paper underneath it from tearing any further than it has to. I can always kind of use an X-Acto knife to kind of cut off the flappy part of the paper later if I need to, but I'm also just not too worried about it. This was a practice. If you're not putting tape right in the middle of your paper, you really usually won't have a problem. It's really this paper, this tape that's in the middle of the paper that's the most difficult to get off. But it sure is satisfying. I can tell you that much. I'll take off this last piece of tape, and that'll be that for this practice. Thank you for painting with me today. I hope it went well. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know if you have any questions. Check out my YouTube channel for other tutorials like this, and I'll see you next time.